All right, awesome. Can everybody hear me clearly? Lovely. All right. So thank you all once again for making time to join in today. My name is Helen Day, and I curate Mythological Africans, which some of you might be aware of. But it's a platform where I talk about mythology and folklore from the African continent. I'm really excited to be here today because we'll be talking about one of my favorite characters or figures in African folklore, and this is the Enfant Terrible. And as I did earlier this morning, I'm putting a quote around the word dread children, because as we will see, some of them can be quite terrible, but also they are delightful characters that will show up in folklore, and they fulfill a very important role in storytelling traditions. So really excited to talk with you about this today. All right, next slide. Oh, and big Sam, can we go back to, to the opening slide if you don't mind? I just want to make sure that I highlight this kid, because from the moment I saw this GIF, it stuck in my head as the epitome of Enfant Terrible energy. There's this kid running up and whacking someone in the face. And like I said earlier, I hope he's having the best of days wherever he is on the planet. So right, on our index, what we'll talk about today, we'll start by defining who the Enfant Terrible is. We'll look at the different characteristics, which if you're reading folklore from some part of the African continent and you see these characteristics, then you know that this is an Enfant Terrible character that you're dealing with. And then we'll look at how common this character shows up in folklore across the continent. And then we'll look at the different kinds of Enfant Terribles, and this is classified by how the characteristics that they manifest. I need to emphasize that this classification is mine. It's not something from somewhere. And there is a book that is focused on Enfant Terribles. I placed a request for it. It didn't get to me on time. So if you are familiar with the book, you might get a different kind of classification. This is just mine based on the folklore that I've read. But I placed them into the precocious category, the transformative category, and the destructive category. And you'll find that they all have elements of precocity and transformativeness or destructiveness. It's just one characteristic or the other is more dominant in them as their stories are told. And then we'll look at why these characters show up at all in folklore from around the continent. And then we'll have a reflection, which I'm going to give you a hint at where we're going with that. What I love is when I talk about African folklore and I have other people come up and say, hey, this character, we have a similar character in the folklore that I'm familiar with. So the reflection period will first be looking at if any of you can think of any Enfant Terrible type characters in the folklore that you know, but also Enfant Terrible type characters in popular folklore or popular culture as it shows up now, all right? Okay, so who is the Enfant Terrible? So the Enfant Terrible is a folkloric character that shows up in a lot of African storytelling traditions. And they combine the characteristics of a hero, an anti-hero, a trickster, and a villain. And the villain part really shows up for some of them. And you will find that in some folklore collections, Enfant Terrible characters are classified as tricksters. And that is because the trickster archetype is pretty dominant in most of them. But as we will see the analysis, the role that they play in the storytelling tradition is a little bit different from the trickster archetype, but also because they also combine aspects like really villainous aspects and really they can be heroes or anti-heroes. They have a lot going on and they occupy a special role, which gives them this designation as Enfant Terrible. Enfant Terribles can be male. They're usually male, but they can be female, and quite often they are one pair of a twin. So we'll look at, we'll have case studies and short readings from folk tales where we have we'll have an example of a Enfant Terrible who is a little girl. We'll also have an Enfant Terrible who is one pair of a twin. But from the stories that I've looked at, there is a very strong dominance in Enfant Terribles who are little boys or young men. All right. And so how do you know you're dealing with an Enfant Terrible? First and foremost is the circumstances around their birth. They are usually very special circumstances around how they're born. They are not born normally the way a woman gives birth. Some of them are born from a thumb. How that is anatomically possible, who knows, but this is folklore we're dealing with here. They're born with their teeth. They're born able to talk, or they're able to communicate with people from when they're in the womb. They're able to have an effect on the world outside of the womb while still in the womb. They're often born with magical objects, and there is a case which just struck horror in my heart. This kid who was born with a stool that had nails stuck into it, and I just kept thinking, his poor mom, like, wow, yikes. And so they're born with several magical objects, which eventually will help them in their quest. And quite often they name themselves. So they are not given names by their communities, as tends to be the case in many communities. They give themselves their own names, and these are usually very lofty names. And then what happens is that immediately after they're born, they tend to challenge some power structure, whether it's familial or communal or royal. Their existence poses a challenge to existing power structures, which then usually leads into their quest, which is taken for various reasons: to kill a monster, sometimes to avenge their father's murder, to find a greater power to challenge because they've proven themselves the most powerful in their communities, to escape threats to their lives because they have proven themselves, to be problematic because they're more powerful than the biggest warrior or the chief or something. And then sometimes they're forced to leave because of their transgressive behavior. The community just can't deal with them anymore, so they're forced out. And in the course of their quests, they have magical helpers, and their quest usually involves cycles of events during which they demonstrate the different aspects of their intelligence or their power. And they get the opportunity to use the different magical objects that they are born with. And then their return, because their story cycles tends to follow the hero's life arc, their return, they're often elevated as a leader. Quite often they return to their divine origin, so they become lightning or thunder or some other manifestation of the natural world, and sometimes they're killed. And what I found was that the Enfant Terrible most likely to be killed or to become lightning or rain or thunder or some manifestation of the natural world are the destructive ones, because the community just can't handle the range and scale of their destruction. Meanwhile, the transformative ones and the precocious ones usually end up as leaders in the community. So where do Enfant Terribles show up in African folklore? Pretty much everywhere from what I could see. The red dots indicate a country from which I could find a story. And these are the stories that I was able to get access to. My guess is that if I did a complete review of folklore from the African continent, there'll be red dots on every single one of the countries. And one dot doesn't necessarily mean one story. Quite often you'll get different versions of a story involving a particular character, or in one country you might have more than one Enfant Terrible type figure. And then across countries, even sometimes you'll have the same figure whose story is told in different kinds of ways. Quite often, it would be because the story is an aspect of a particular people's folklore, and the people are spread across more than one country. And Enfant Terribles are believed to have originated out of the Malinke or the Mandinka oral traditions. The Malinke people are found in Mali, but as you can see, the storytelling tradition has pretty much, that figure has pretty much spread all over the African continent and adapted itself to the different cultures in which it has found itself. And something which popped in my head after I gave the talk this morning is there is a role that Enfant Terribles play in their cultures, which we'll talk about, which perhaps explains why these stories have spread so far. And we'll talk about that later. So types of Enfant Terribles. Like I said, I have this classification of 3 types of Enfant Terribles: the precocious, the transformative, and the destructive. And the precocious Enfant Terribles tend to be very intelligent and resourceful. These are the child prodigies, genius level intelligence, which they use to solve problems or challenge existing power structures. And that's what makes them a problem, because they're able to see things and do things in a way that the leadership or the people who run the community are not, and then that makes them problematic and makes people want to challenge them or kill them. Quite often, at the end of their story, they are elevated to a leader. They replace the current existing leadership structure. And sometimes they have magical powers and magical helpers. Quite often they get by on their wits alone. And they tend not to be destructive unless necessary, say to kill a monster or to stop some havoc from happening, then they would destroy it. But destruction tends not to be an aspect of their behavior. The transformative Enfant Terribles are also intelligent and resourceful. They tend to be physically powerful. They tend to be warriors or great hunters, people who rely on their brawn as much as their brains. They also challenge existing power structures. Quite often, they're elevated to leadership positions. Usually, they themselves have magical powers. And when necessary, they can be quite destructive, either for, useful purposes or just on a whim. And they usually get into trouble when they are that destructive. Now, the destructive Enfant Terribles are just chaos, like chaotic evil is the best way to describe the destructive Enfant Terribles, because they are crafty, they're smart, but their smarts, their craftiness is usually towards the destructive end. They don't just challenge existing power structures, they completely disrupt them. They throw havoc into every situation they get into. They're rarely elevated to leadership positions. They're often taken away by divine forces or killed just because of the scale of how destructive they've been. They usually have magical powers. And as their name implies, they are breathtakingly destructive, and we'll see a couple of examples of these. I remember watching Sam as I read that one story, and she kept going, what is this? Why are they doing this? So yeah, all right. So we'll start with the Precocious Enfant Terribles, the first being the Sense-Pass King character, which shows up in a lot of folklore from West Africa. Now, Sense-Pass King is West African Pidgin English, which translates loosely to more intelligent than the king. And this is the problem, because in many communities, the king is the epitome of wisdom and knowledge and strength and power. So to position yourself as more intelligent than the king is basically, an affront to royal power, a challenge to royal power. A Sense-Pass King characters tend to be boys, but as is in the case we will talk about here, they can also be girls, and they are the child prodigy variety of the Enfant Terribles. So in this Sense-Pass King story from Cameroon, this is one of two. In this particular story, the girl Manta'a is born, and by the time she was a year old, she could walk, she could talk, she could solve problems. And so people started calling her Sense-Pass King, which when the king found out, he was not pleased. So he orders for the child to be murdered, essentially. So his guards show up at her parents' house and take her. They're going to go drop her in the middle of the forest, so she'll be eaten by wild animals. But she takes a handful of wood ash and hides it in her dress. And as they walk with her into the forest, she leaves a trail of wood ash along the way. So when they abandon her and leave her there, she simply follows the trail of wood ash to come back home. Comes back and becomes even more prolific in her, I'm sorry, my cat just bit me. Becomes even more prolific in her activities, solving problems, helping people farm better, rear animals better, solves problems in the community, and becomes even more prolific than she was, which enrages the king even more. So he orders for a pit to be dug where she could be buried alive. So when she finds out that the king is doing this, she talks to her friends, the rat moles, because while she was in the forest, she learned how to talk with the animals. And the rat moles go dig a tunnel from the hole the king dug all the way to her parents' house. So when the guards show up to arrest her, she just goes with them, and they throw her in the hole and fill the hole with dirt, and she just follows this tunnel back to her parents' house. So the king at this point is just baffled, is this child indestructible? And he says, well, if I can't beat her, I'll make her one of my counselors. So he brings her to the palace, and she becomes one of his counselors. As you see there in the picture, he listens to her advice, uses the information that she gives him to make his kingdom better. But then the king of another empire sends his daughter, who is still a child, to the king to say, this is your wife. When she grows older, you can marry her. But the problem was that this child will not eat. And so the king didn't want this child to die on his watch, so he turns to Manta'a to help him figure out how to get her to eat. And she devises an instrument with bells and rattles, and she would shake it, and this would delight the little girl so much she would open her mouth and start laughing. And while her mouth was open, Manta'a would throw food in there to make sure she ate. And but then they would go on a journey, and they are attacked by this gigantic monster with multiple heads. And the only way to kill this monster was to take out all of its eyes, which proved really challenging because it had multiple heads with two eyes, and they were swaying in all directions. And so Manta'a comes up with a strategy to get the monster to turn its head in a particular direction that has all its eyes aligned in one straight line. And as you can see in the badass picture of her right there, she uses one arrow and takes out all the eyes at the same time, which is just incredible. But then they get back to their kingdom, And the chief says he is the one who destroyed the monster, which just completely disgusts his soldiers. They tell on him, they tell the people that he's lying, and that was just the ultimate blow to the king's position. So he gets deposed, and Manta'a becomes queen, and this little girl doesn't have to marry this guy anymore, and she just completely changed the kingdom. So that's Manta'a's story. There is another example of a sense-pass king type character also from Cameroon. So I think Manta'a, just listening to the name, I think she's probably from the Mancon people. I'm going to do a quick reading of another sense-pass king type character from the Beba people in Cameroon. And this story is from a collection of folktales from Cameroon called The Sacred Door and Other Stories, Cameroon Folktales of the Beba. And in this story, the sense-pass king type character is called Médecin Satsefo, which means sense-pass king. And so it happened that the woman had a baby boy, and in accordance with the king's edict, she put the child on her back and made for the palace, because the king had required that all children be presented to him so he could name them. She had not descended 2 hills and crossed 2 streams when she heard her son speak. "Mother, let's go home," he said. "Why should the fawn name me? Don't I have fathers, mothers, uncles, grandparents? The fawn will not name me. My name is Médecin Satsefo." The woman dumbfounded. "How is it possible?" she asked herself. "How is it that my child can speak? My son is merely a baby. And why does he say his name is Médecin Satsefo? Why does he claim to be more intelligent than the king? This is unheard of. The child smarter than the king." So she gathered her anxiety and turned around and went back home. But she feared for her son. She feared the king's wrath. And so years passed, and the news finally got to the king that this woman had had a child, a son, and that this child had named himself. And the child had not only named himself, the child had named himself Médecin Satsefo. So he was just infuriated by this, and he would not abide it. So he summoned the child to the palace. The four summons Médecin Satsefo to the palace, and the Tsindia, who are the chief's knights, notified the boy that the fawn's order was to bring him to the palace. "Why?" the boy asked. "Well, the sovereign wants you to give him a haircut," the knight said. And Médecin Satsefo was taken aback by this request, because the kings have special barbers who are the only ones allowed to cut their hair. So why send for him? Why bestow such an honor on a mere commoner, a mere boy for that matter? The Chinda, of course, had no answers for the young man. "I am only a message bearer," the Chinda said. "When the king asks me to take a message to one of his subjects, I do not question his motives." So Médecin Satsefo boiled some fresh corn on cob and put some in his bag and left for the palace. When he arrived, he was cordially welcomed by the king, who laid out an array of razors in front of the young man. Before he began his duty, Médecin Satsefo coughed into his cupped hands and stepped in front of the king and removed 2 warm maize cobs from his bag and offered them to the king. The sweet aroma, the smell of the baby palm wine that young women like to drink soon filled the room. The corn smelled really good. And Fuatabe took the drink, the corn, ate it. He didn't even call for his tasters, to check if it was poison. He ate it right away. And while he ate, Médecin Satsefo cut his hair. And then he announced that he had finished his job. And the king smiled, like the cat who got the rat, and says, "My son, have you finished?" "Yes, Mbe," which is the way you address the king in the northwest region of Cameroon. "Is it well done?" the king asked. "I think your majesty will like it." And then Atabe laughed and said, "Now, my son, I want you to put all my hair back on my head." "Did I hear you correctly?" Médecin Satsefo asked. "I said I order you to put all my hair back on my head." "Why, your majesty?" "Well, first, you've done something you should never have done. You should cut the king's hair. You are not a quop. You are not a kingmaker. How dare you presume to be so bold? If you do not do what I ask you to do right now, you will die at sunset." "Mbe," Médecin Satsefo stammered. "Can a child re-enter its mother's womb after it has been born?" "I do not argue with children," Atabe snapped. "I want my hair back on my scalp, or you lose your head at sundown." "Great king, if that is your wish, I will do it on one condition." "You are lucky I'm in a good mood today. Speak." "I will do it on one condition, my lord. I want you to put all the grains of corn you ate while I was shaving your hair back on the cob. Once that's done, your hair will be safely back on your head." And of course, because the king could not do that, he could not put the corn back on the cob, and he had given his word, this whole deal fell apart. And so another cycle occurs with the king trying to con him and kill him, and he outwits the king, and it goes on and on and on and on. The king also tries to murder him by burying him alive. That doesn't work, and eventually the king is deposed and Metin Satsefo is made king. So this is another Saint-Pass king type story. On the next slide, we have more examples of precocious Saint-Pass king, precocious Enfant Terrible characters from African folklore. We have Ansia Koti, who is a similar Saint-Pass king type character, but from the Mosi people in Togo. Bita Loane from the social, and Bita Loane's story, he kills a monster who had swallowed the whole world. He lets the monster swallow him, and then he cuts the monster's stomach open from the inside, and the whole world comes back out. There is a story of Kejok from the Dinka in Sudan, and Kejok's story, he's born a miraculous birth, and he performs miracles, and his family gets jealous, and one of his brothers, threatens to kill him. So he leaves Earth, kind of like ascends to heaven and promises to return. And amongst the Dinka people, there are some who believe that Kejok will return. There is Libanza from the Boloki people in the Central African Republic, and then there is Mokele from the Mungo Nkundo people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the list of references I have there are the sources for these characters, and I believe Tales Told in Togoland by Ellen Cardinal and African Mythology A to Z are available for free, like PDFs online. So if you want to go check out these stories, you can definitely do that for yourself. All right. Now, speaking of transformative enfant terribles, we come to Windo on the next slide, one of my favorite characters from African folklore, because he is, and pardon my language, he is a shit talker extraordinary. And that's part of his allure as an enfant terrible, is that he's not just powerful and magical, he lets everybody know just how powerful and magical he is. And the Mwindo story is part of the Mwindo epic, which is one of these grand stories that incorporates so many aspects of the beliefs and culture of the Nyanga people. It is usually performed by a bard who uses sound effects and background players to add sound effects to the story. And the performance includes not just the recitation of the story, there is poetry, songs, prayers, blessings, proverbs, riddles, and so much that is incorporated. It's quite a long story. So I will read just the first part, which includes the story of how Mindo was born and his father's attempts to murder him. And so Shem Windo, who is Windo's father, had given an edict that none of his wives were to give birth to a boy child who would challenge his power. He only wanted girl children who would not be able to challenge his power. And also, because he was so powerful, Shem Windo became very famous, not only in Tubondo, his land, but throughout the country. And many of his wives got pregnant, and many days passed and they got into labor. They all gave birth to female children. One wife amongst them, the seventh and the preferred one, lagged behind in her pregnancy. When she saw that her companions had given birth, whereas she was still heavy with child, she complained continually. How terrible is this? It is only I who is still dragged down by this pregnancy. What then shall I do? My companions with whom I became pregnant at the same time have already gone through it all, and I alone remain with my burden. What will come of this pregnancy? And just after she finished these sad reflections, she found a bunch of firewood at her door. She did not know from where it had come, but it was her child, the one that was inside her womb, who had just brought it. After some time passed, while looking around the house, the preferred one discovered a jar of water standing there. She did not know from whence it had come. It was as if it had brought itself into the house. And again, after some time, she found raw vegetables sitting inside the house. Now she was even more astonished. It was the child in her womb who was carrying out all these miraculous tasks for her. When the inhabitants of the village saw that the preferred one continued to drag on with her pregnancy, they started sneering at her. When is this one going to give birth? They would mock. The child, dwelling in the womb of its mother, meditated to itself, saying that it could not come out from the under part of the body of its mother because people might think that it was born of a woman and make fun of it. He did not want to emerge from his mother's mouth, for then they might make fun of him too, saying that he had been vomited up like a bat. But the pregnancy had gone so far beyond its term that the midwives and counselors came. But when they arrived, the preferred one went into labor. The child in the womb climbed to her belly, wandered through her limbs and torso, and went on and came out through her middle. The old wives were astonished when they saw him wailing on the ground. They pointed at him, asking, "What kind of child is this?" Some amongst them saw that it was a male child and were worried. They wanted to shout about it, to the village that the male child had been born, but others refused, saying that no one could say that the child was a boy, because Shemwindo, his father, would kill him. The counselor sitting with Shemwindo shouted, asking, "What sort of a child is born there?" But the old midwife sitting in the house kept their silence, never giving an answer. Afterwards, they gave him the name Windo, firstborn male, for there had only been female children born in that family before him. But in the house where the birth took place that day, a cricket appeared on the wall, carrying omens of great and dreadful things. After Shemwindo had asked what child was born and the midwives refused to answer, the cricket left the birth house and carried the news to him. "Chief," it said, "a male child has been born to you. They call him Windo, the first boy child, and that is why those in the hut have not answered you." When Shemwindo heard that his preferred one had given birth to a boy, he took up his spear. He sharpened it on a whetstone and carried it to the house where the child had been born. But the moment he prepared to throw it into the hut, the child shouted from inside, saying, "Each time this spear is thrown, may it hit the bottom of the household where the household spirits reside. May it never end up where the old midwives are seated. Neither may it arrive at the place where my mother is." Shemwindo threw the spear into the house 6 times, and each time it hit nothing but the pole. When the old midwives saw those extraordinary happenings, they swarmed out of the house, fleeing, saying to one another that they did not want to die in that place. When Shemwindo became exhausted in his anger, he ran back and forth with his spear, still thinking about a way to kill Windo. Eventually, he spoke to his counselors, saying that they should dig a grave to throw Windo into, for he did not want a male child. When the counselors heard the order of the lord of their village, they did not argue with him. Rather, they went ahead and dug the grave. When the grave was finished, they went forth to fetch the child Windo. They carried him gently, as a baby should be handled, and went to bury him. But Windo howled from within the grave, saying, "Oh, my father, this is the death that you will die. But first, you will suffer many sorrows," and many sorrows he did suffer, I might say. When Shemwindo heard the remarkable curse of the little castaway, he scolded his people, telling them to cover the grave right away. The people fetched the leaves and twigs and laid on the grave as was the custom, and then they heaped much soil on top of it. But at that very moment, it became evident that Windo had been born with a conga scepter, the royal fly swatter made of the buffalo tail, which he held in his right hand. He also carried an adze, which he carried in his left hand. A little bag of the spirit of Kahombo, the carrier of good fortune, was slung across his back on the left side, and in that little bag was a long magic rope. Most wondrously, Windo had been born laughing and also speaking, already a man amongst men. When the day was ending, those sitting outdoors looked to where Windo had been discarded earlier in the day, and they saw that there was light coming forth as though the sun was shining from within the grave. They ran to the others in the village, and they came running. They saw the emanation, but they could not stand there because of the great heat which emanated like fire from the grave. As one would pass by, he would attempt to cast his eyes on the light, but he would have to move on. It was so bright. When everyone had fallen asleep for the night, Windo emerged from the grave and sneaked into his mother's house. There, he began to wail. In his home, Shemwindo heard the child's wailing and was totally astonished, saying, "This time, what was never seen is seen for the first time. A child is crying again in that house. Has my wife given birth to another child?" He was unsure of what to do, but he decided to go see what was happening. He arrived at the hut, peeked through the open door, and cast an eye on the child sleeping on the floor. "Where does this child come from?" he asked, entering the hut and questioning his wife. "Did you leave another one in the womb to whom you have given birth?" The wife replied to him, "This is Windo." From where Windo sat on the ground, he kept silent. Shemwindo, witnessing this marvelous event, was left speechless. He woke up his counselors and said to them, "I was not deceived. Windo has returned. Tomorrow, when the sky will have become day, you will cut a piece from the trunk of a tree, you will carve in it a husk or a drum, and then you will put the hide of an antelope in the river to soften." And so I'll just summarize here. They make this drum, make it beautiful, put the child Windo into it and cast it in the river and sink it. But of course, they don't succeed in sinking it. So they basically let him float down the river and travel to the kingdom of his aunt who had married the river god. And he goes to the river god's kingdom and causes all kinds of havoc, and then comes back to his father's kingdom to challenge him and causes all kinds of havoc. And he is transformative because eventually he deposes his father as king and replaces him as king. But in the course of all of that, he destroys so much. At one point, he gets his uncles on his mother's side to fight for him, but in the first battle, they all get slaughtered. It was a massacre. Everybody in the village and the animals and the plants, everything gets massacred. But then he uses his power to reanimate them, and they go to war again, and this time they're successful, and his father flees to the underworld, and he follows him there and has to face up with the lord of the underworld and destroys a bunch of the monsters in the underworld. But eventually he's crowned king and deposes his father. Some say his father is banished, some say his father is killed, but then he becomes king. But being the arrogant little jerk that he is, he goes out and kills a dragon who is friends with the god of lightning, who in all his exploits had helped Mwindo. So Nkuba, the god of lightning, had helped Mwindo win some of his battles. But then he goes off and kills Kirimu the dragon, who had sworn a blood oath with Nkuba. So Nkuba comes down to say, hey, dude, why did you kill my friend? I thought we were on the same side. And instead of apologizing, Mwindo basically talks shit to Nkuba. And Kuba says, okay, I'm gonna have to teach you a lesson. So he grabs Mwindo by the scruff and takes him up to the heavens. And Mwindo is punished by the sun, punished by the moon, punished by the rain, punished by the stars. And this is what finally puts some, humility into Mwindo and enables him to come back to earth and rule as a good leader. So you have the different aspects of the Enfant Terrible trope here: the destructiveness, the ascension into the skies with divine forces, the return as a king. And I love Mwindo's story just because he's just a favorite character of mine. He's just such a distinctive and funny character, but also because it really brings together so much of what is great about the Enfant Terrible character, especially in how they can really change a society. So on the next slide, we have a list of different Enfant Terribles that will show up in African folklore, transformative types. There is Sudika Mbambi from the Mbundu in Angola, Mubila from the Lega people in the DRC, Ewa Longa and Akomamba from the Fang in Cameroon. And once again, all of these stories you can read from Patricia Ann Lynch and Jeremy Roberts' African Mythology A to Z. And so we come to the destructive Enfant Terrible. And like I said, these ones, they're just chaotic evil. They destroy for the heck of it. But even with that destruction, there's a particular role that they fulfill, which, like I said, we'll talk about. And we'll look at two case studies here. There's Bassa, an Enfant Terrible from the Gurunsi people in Burkina Faso. And then we'll also look at the story of Lakayana from the Zulu and Xhosa people in South Africa. Now, Bassa is one pair of a twin. He's the boy, Bassa, and his sister is Kassa. So it's an example of a who shows up as one of a twin. And this is Bassa's story. So their parents give birth to them. They have a mother and a father. And unremarkable, they grow up until they start going to the farm with their parents. And one day, while Bassa and Kassa are working, Bassa sees a little viper that, runs and hides in a hole. And if you know anything about vipers, when vipers are young, if they bite you, they put all their poison into you, you're actually more likely to be killed by a baby viper than an adult one, because the baby has no control. It just pumps all it has into you. And so, before all of this, one of the instructions that their parents had given them was that they were never to argue with each other. They were never to contradict each other. They were supposed to get along at all costs, to be loyal to each other at all costs. So keep that in mind, because that's important. So they go to the farm. Bassa sees this viper that goes into a hole. So he says, hey, Kassa, I'm going to tell our father that there is a cane rat in there. So he has to reach in and grab it so we can have something to eat. And Kassa goes, why would you do that? There's a viper in there. And he goes, well, didn't they tell you to never contradict me? We're supposed to get along. You're supposed to be loyal to me. So you can't question me. And Kassa is like, okay. So he calls his father over, tells him there's a cane rat in the hole. Of course, Dad sticks his hand into the hole, gets bitten by a viper, and he dies. So now they're left with their mom, who has to work and raise these two children. Poor woman, right? Well, one day she sends them to bring leaves for them to cook. And Bassa sees another viper. And he says, hey, Kassa, I'm going to put this viper in the basket of leaves so that when mom sticks her hand in there, she's going to get bit. And once again, Kassa is asking, why would you do that? Like, what's wrong with you? And again, he says, didn't they tell you that we were never to argue with each other? We're never to contradict each other. You should let me do what I want. So of course he puts the viper in the container. Mom sticks her hand in there, gets bit, and dies. And so the news spread that these children have killed their parents, and it's just outrageous. The king hears about it, makes an edict. Nobody is to feed these two, parricidal children, let them die. But then one of the king's wives, sees these two young children, soft as heart. They probably didn't even know what they were doing. So she sticks them some food, but she gives them explicit instructions. Eat the food, throw the plates away. Don't bring them back to the palace, because then you give it away that I brought you food. So they eat the food, and Bassa says, well, we're going to take the bowls back to the palace. And Casa goes, well, why? Why would you do that? We were told you're going to get this woman in trouble. And once again, he goes, weren't you told to not contradict me? We're supposed to get along. You're supposed to be loyal to me. And so Casa says, all right. So they take the plates back to the palace. The king is furious and orders this woman to be burned to death, and the children captured. The woman gets burned to death. The children escape into a tree in the king's courtyard, in the palace courtyard. So the next day after the burning, the king is, of course, upset. He had to kill his wives. He has these crazy children running around in his kingdom. So he goes and lays down under the tree to take a nap in the afternoon. And Bassa says, hey, Casa, I'm going to defecate on the king's head. And once again, Casa goes, why would you do that? What is wrong with you? And once again, aren't we supposed to not ever contradict each other? You should let me do what I want. So he defecates on the chief's head. The king is furious and orders lumberjacks to come along and cut this tree. So they come and hack at it with their axes. And just as the tree is about to fall down, this little lizard comes and chirps. It's a magical little lizard, chirps, and the tree magically rights itself, stops falling, becomes whole. And so every time the lumberjacks cut the tree down, the lizard chirps and the tree gets whole. So it keeps saving the children. And then Bassa goes, I'm going to kill this lizard. And once again, Casa is, what is wrong with you? Why would you do this? Again, the pushback, you're not supposed to contradict me. So he kills the lizard. And of course, the tree falls down, and they fall down. And as they're about to be captured, an eagle comes by and picks them up and swoops away with them. So they're saved by this eagle. They're hop up in the sky, admiring the panorama. And Bassa gets bored. He goes, I'm going to poke this eagle in its anus. And Casa, again, question mark, question mark, question mark, what is wrong with you? Gets the same pushback. So Bassa does what he wants. They fall. The eagle, of course, shakes them off. They fall off. And as they're falling, they're caught by a tortoise caught in its shell. But as soon as they gain their wits, Bassa goes, yummy, yummy, yummy tortoise. We should cook it and eat it. And Casa goes, what is wrong with you? Why would you do this? Gets the same pushback. So they cook up this tortoise and eat it. Carry on their way. They meet a couple of farmers who they offer to take care of the farmers' children while the children work. The farmers say, oh, great, you're trying to be helpful. Give them a frog to cook and feed the child. But they cook the child and try to feed the child to the frog, again, at Bassa's prompting. And then they go to the people and say, hey, the frog won't eat your child. And the people said, why would you cook our child and try to feed to a frog? They have to escape. And just these cycles and cycles of them, they destroy the farm of an old woman who feeds them. And instead of helping her, they completely wreck her farm. They meet another group of people who feed them. And instead of helping the people, they take their whole harvest and dump into a river. So it gets, carried away. And then eventually, just the most maniacal act that they've carried out so far, they come to this woman who's cooking shea butter, big vat of hot oil, and they offer to help her. Now, mind you, this woman is pregnant. Offer to help her, take over stirring the pot of oil, and then at Bassa's prompting, pick up this pot of oil and pour on this poor woman who's pregnant. Fortunately, she survives, but they escape. So she swears to have a revenge on them. She makes, pastries, sweet pastries that children would love, and goes looking for these children. And the question she asks as she goes from village to village, what are the most badly behaved children in this village? So of course, because the children want the puff pastries, all the children will list the bad things that they have done, and she keeps saying, no, you're not quite. But eventually she runs into Bassa and Casa, and Bassa very proudly lists the long list of things that they have been up to, the evil things that they have been up to. And she says, yeah, you're the one I'm looking for. So she invites them back to her house for more pastries. They get there, she traps them and puts them in a bag. And then she goes off to cook up another pot of hot oil, because she's going to give them the same punishment that they gave her. But while they're stuck in the bag and she's off cooking, her own children, she was pregnant. She had twins too. They come by and they're like, hey, what's going on? And Bassa says, well, your mom has us here because she's gone off to make pastries. So when she comes back, we're going to get the best pastries ever. Do you want some? The kids are like, yeah. And Bassa goes, well, all you have to do is switch with us. You go in the back, we get out. And then when your mom comes back, she'll give you the pastries thinking it's us. And so the kids agree. So this woman comes back and, she's saying, I'm going to show you, I'm going to put you in the hot oil the way you did to me. And so her children start screaming, no, mom, it's us. And she says, I don't care. You're these two evil children. You're probably impersonating my children right now. I don't care. I'm going to burn you all the same. So she drops her own children into the vat of hot oil. And of course, when she discovers, she's heartbroken and, just aghast. But Bassa and Casa have taken off. And they run off and find a group of people who are fighting, like kind of a melee going on. They're flying in the air and doing all sorts of acrobatic feats, fighting each other. And they're like, yeah, these look like our kinds of people. So they join in and they fight and they fight and fight and fight. And eventually they're taken up into the heavens. And the Gurunsi say, Bassa is the clap of thunder, that loud sound. And that loud sound is him saying, I want to destroy the earth. And the echo, the soft echo of thunder, the rumble that follows is Casa, to say, be careful, there's people, there's children down there, you can't just destroy everything. So not very likable, are they, these destructive Enfant Terribles? I remember reading this story and thinking, what in the world? But as we will see, as horrible as they are, they have an important message to pass across. Another example of destructive Enfant Terrible is Hakayana. And if we go to the next slide, there's a whole list of different kinds of Enfant Terribles of the destructive variety that show up in folklore. There's Makoma from the Sena people in Tanzania, and he is born powerful and goes on a rampage across the land trying to find the biggest monsters to destroy, and in the process destroys forests, destroys rivers, flattens mountains, just basically ravages the ecosystem, and eventually meets his match in a mountain range called Sakaterina of the Five Heads, which is so tall and so big and so powerful, he can't overcome it. So he eventually becomes part of that mountain range. Zurjir is a character from Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinker. And he's an Enfant Terrible type character who's also just destructive, eats everything in sight, beats everyone in sight, kills everyone, just destructive. And the only way they could get rid of him was to have him taken off by the, Yoruba equivalent of the fairy. So there is drumming, singing, and dancing, and there are these entities, and they're the only ones who are able to enchant Zurjir, and he goes off singing and dancing with them and finally leaves his parents alone. And then there is Lakayana from the Xhosa and Zulu people. And I'll just read Lakayana's story real quick because there's a short summary of it that I could find. And it said that he spoke before he was born, and he repeatedly stated his impatience about wanting to enter the world. All the women of the village had children except for the chief's wife. And one day when the men were slaughtering oxen, the chief's wives heard a voice telling her, "Bear me, mother." And the voice kept repeating this until the woman gave birth to Lakayana, who was a tiny infant with the face of an old man. He at once went to the cattle kraal and began to eat a strip of roasting meat. Everyone was amazed. But when the butchering was finished, Lakayana offered to carry all the men's shares of meat to their huts for them. Instead of doing that, he smeared some blood on the mat in each hut and brought all the meat to his mother's hut. When the men arrived at their huts, they asked Lakayana where the meat was, and he pointed to the bloody mats and said that he had put the meat there, but the dogs must have eaten them. The dogs and the men's wives and children must have eaten them, and the men got so angry and they beat their wives and children because they had not guarded the meat from the dogs. The adventure continues. Lakayana uses repeated acts of trickery to get food. In one story, he wants an ox head that was being cooked, and he drives the village cattle into the forest and ties them by their tails to trees. And then he cuts himself with a stone so he was covered in blood, and told the villagers that enemies had stolen all the cattle and wounded him while he tried to stop them. The men grabbed their spears and ran off in pursuit of the cattle, and while they were gone, Lakayana eats all the meat in the pot. And his last bit of trickery cost him his life because he met a tortoise, which he thought he could cook and eat, but offered to carry the tortoise refused. So he picks it up and puts it on his back by force, takes it to his mother. But then as his mother is trying to get the tortoise off him, she gets the idea to pour hot oil on the tortoise. And while she's doing that, the tortoise releases its grip, jumps off Lakayana as the hot oil is falling. So she pours hot oil on her son instead. And Lakayana's story at the beginning, his father just completely disowns him and refuses to feed him, refuses to take care of him. And this is what triggers this crazy adventure that he's on, which eventually leads to his death. So as we see with the destructive five Enfant Terribles, they tend to get killed or taken away by divine forces. They tend not to remain in the community, mostly because, you know, a lot of their acts have just been completely taboo and destructive. So why these characters in folklore? The main reason is that they highlight because if we think about folklore as a means by which a community can communicate their values, the taboos and the norms, they highlight the taboos, the things that should not be done, the transgression of which can have dire consequences. They also expose weaknesses in a community's norms, and in some cases, they offer a means to address these. So if we go back to look at the different stories we've looked at, the idea that the chief or the king can name himself as the most powerful, the most, you know, which it does happen, you know, the chiefs have and kings have these honorific titles, but there's the understanding is that the ruler's power is in the strength of his advisors and the strength of his community. So if he elevates himself too much, then that's creating an imbalance which has to be addressed. So you have the sense-basking characters who tend to knock the king down a notch, or otherwise you have a community where you're led by a tyrant, right? In Windows story, for example, you have a king who was so attached to power, he was willing to kill a child to stay in power. So you have this character who shows up to correct this imbalance that has shown itself up in society. In Vakayana's story, for example, you have, again, a child who was disowned by his father, and in his repeated acts of transgression shows what can happen when a community doesn't adhere to the values that they need to. And for Bassa and Kassa's story, I thought about that one for a while because I kept thinking, what could possibly be the intention here? You know, what could this be illustrating? But then if you go back to the first instruction that their parents gave them, be loyal to each other no matter what, that's the problem. You can't have a community where there's blind loyalty. There always has to be a means for you to say, hey, this is not right. Otherwise, you have a situation where someone could go on a destructive rampage and it's not challenged because you have to get together at all costs. So why these dread children? If we go to the next slide, they usually are these vengeful spirits which show the unimaginable destruction and violation which can come out of a society that is thrown into disorder by a breach which goes unchecked, and the breach can be of different kinds. And they usually are a severe and absurd way to correct these situations. Another possibility which came up, I read about it very briefly because I think I mentioned this, one of the books about Enfant Terrible, I put in requests for it too late, so I didn't get the book, and I don't want to speak, you know, without getting the full picture. I plan to do a follow-up thread after this on Twitter after this conversation. One of the things they say is that Enfant Terrible stories are also a way to capture the stages that need to happen, but the initiation stages that need to happen for people to become parts of society, especially if these are people born with abilities and ways of perceiving the world which deviate from the norm. They encode a pathway through which these people can be brought into community, find their place in society. And because I don't have a story that really illustrates that, that's all I'm going to say on that effect, but keep an eye out for that thread because we'll explore that a little bit more. So, and if we go to the next slide, it illustrates the specific case of Flakayana, right? To transform an unhealthy society into a healthy one by, you know, pushing against the weak link in the society, pushing against the little aspects of the community that don't make sense, with the intention of breaking them so that the community can reform and be stronger for it. So that's the theme that shows up across the different kinds of Enfant Terrible characters that we see, whether precocious or transformative or destructive. The ultimate goal is for them to highlight the ways in which a community's norms may be working against it and introduce that chaos, that, you know, productive generative chaos that can lead to a better community. So that's what I have. And if we want to think about, you know, the reflection, like I said, first question, are there any similar characters in the folk tales that you're aware of? And this doesn't have to be, you know, exact replica of Enfant Terrible, just circumstances, the miraculous birth or different characteristics. I was looking at the chat as we went along. I saw someone mention Athena or Artemis, one of the Greek goddesses who was born, I think, with a spear or something. Definitely a characteristic of an Enfant Terrible there. But are there any characters in the folktales that you know who have Enfant Terrible-like characteristics? And if we look at modern pop culture, can you think of any Enfant Terrible type characters that you can think about? So we'll get into that discussion, but I have references if you want to go look at these stories yourself. A lot of these are available as free PDFs online, and it's fascinating reading. I definitely encourage you to try. But also, if you want to join the Mythological Africans community, we have a Twitter page, Mythic Africans. Feel free to follow. We also have the mythologicalafricans.com website where you can get to the YouTube channel, sign up for our newsletter, and get access to all the other fun that we have going on. So thank you all for making time. I hope you enjoyed the stories and these crazy characters. But yeah, any questions, comments? I see things popping up in the chat. So yeah.